have on my hand a watch, and this watch is intricate. There are thousands of different pieces that compose this contraption that I use to tell the time. There are pieces of metal. Actually, on this watch, there are pieces of wood. There are tiny screws and certain gears inside the watch to make the hands of the actual watch itself move. And of course, there's the glass, the face, that protects what I'm wearing. In this, making something like a watch is exceedingly difficult. In fact, I would argue it's impossible for any single person to do. Suppose that a man thinks he can, however. Let's see if that's true. Firstly, considering that my watch is wood, you would have to go and make an axe. Of course, you would need an axe in order to cut down a tree. Well, how do you make an axe? You take some lumber, some wood that you found, and then you take some metal to make the head of the axe that can be used to chop. But of course, that axe head is made of metal, as I mentioned. Well, that means you have to mine it. And what type of metal are you going to mine? And how are you going to shape it? How are you going to transport that metal? And so on and so on. And that's just for the axe. Suppose that you actually did make it. Then you cut down the tree, whichever tree you think would be best for constructing a watch. After that, you have to then shape that tree, which of course is very large and very dense and very cumbersome. Then you have to transport it. You cut it into pieces. You shape it in a mill. You have to build the mill. You have to build the vehicles to run and to operate at the mill. You have to build the machines at the mill, which are made of metal and rubber and plastic, all of which also you'd have to make. And that's just for the band of the watch, let alone the metal hands and the intricate screws and the interior gears. All of these things already show us that literally millions, if not billions, of factors have gone into making something as simple as this watch. Now, the way we figure out whether or not we should make something, like a watch, is by using a market. You see, a market takes all of these scarce resources we have in society. That is, we live in a finite world. We don't have an infinite amount of iron. We don't have an infinite amount of cotton. We have to allocate those resources, therefore. And so a market does that by giving people or generating for people profit and wealth. That is, suppose that I'm a miner and I mine nickel, or perhaps I mine iron. If society thinks that that nickel or iron is useful to them, then they're going to pay me for it. They'll transfer me cash in exchange for my services, my labor, and of course, the metal itself. That's what's important. In this, if I'm making a profit, I rightfully assume and I rightfully conclude that society values that good. And so the maker of the watch will pay a miner, indirectly, I'm oversimplifying, but the logic holds true, to mine some metal. In the same way, the watchmaker will pay a lumberjack to cut down a tree. And he'll also pay a millwright to mill that lumber and to make it into certain shapes. Because he's paying them, because those other workers in the workforce are earning profit, it signals to them that what they're doing is beneficial, is useful to society. And then when we look on the shelves, of course, there is my product waiting for me. We don't suffer from shortages, and we don't have an oversupply of goods either. The market balances everything in equilibrium. Now, of course, there are, again, millions or billions of factors that can switch this equilibrium. So perhaps, who knows, a hurricane happens somewhere where there's a massive nickel mine, and it leads to the mine itself collapsing. That means there is a smaller supply of nickel available in the world, and so the price of the watch or whatever goods have nickel in them will rise in order to compensate and in order to ensure that there are no supply shortages. This, again, is a good thing because it means that all of our goods are kept in equilibrium and we run in an efficient society. But then you read what Klaus Schwab and the WEF is proposing. I might remind you that they have openly stated that Trudeau is one of their most devoted disciples. What Klaus Schwab is proposing is something called stakeholder capitalism. And it's different from the free market shareholder capitalism that we have right now. Put simply, stakeholder capitalism works like this. Mr. Schwab says, suppose that there is a coal plant that's producing energy. Let's say it's in Alberta. He then goes, well, that coal plant produces also emissions. Perhaps they produce heavy emissions, perhaps they don't, but they produce emissions nonetheless, precisely because they burn coal. Mr. Schwab then argues that because they produce emissions, those coal plants produce emissions, and because you and I live in Alberta, we should have a say whether or not that coal plant is able to produce power at all. You see, he argues that because we're affected by the emissions in Alberta, because we have to breathe in what the coal plant exhausts from its system, then we should have a say in whether or not that coal plant is able to operate. Never mind that neither you nor I have a stake or a share in that coal plant. We're not owners of it. We don't have a share in the plant itself. We're merely citizens in this regard. Nonetheless, Mr. Schwab says it affects us, and so we should be able to decide what it's able to do. And you can expand this. Say that there's a coal plant in perhaps Saskatchewan, and maybe it's a very large coal plant, and maybe it's producing more emissions than what is normal. And so it's argued that perhaps all of Canada, every Canadian, should have a say, should decide whether or not that coal plant should be able to produce. And in a sense, actually, this is what Bill C-69 does, the No More Pipelines bill, because it enables the federal government to approve or disapprove a pipeline based on the public interest, or any energy project for that matter. It's as though, in the words of the bill, that all Canadians have a say in whether or not an energy project is produced or not, even though those Canadians aren't owners of the energy project. What does this really mean? What it really means is that the WEF and these other massive world order powers are trying to impose upon us communism. Because if everyone owns everything, it's the same thing as everyone owning nothing. You see, then we have two options before us. On the one hand, we can journey to a new independent nation. We can see Alberta become independent, and we can protect and enshrine free markets in the Constitution so that we're able to efficiently generate a desirable output of goods in society. We would have neither shortages nor an oversupply of goods. In fact, the market would ensure that an equilibrium balances out. Or we can remain in Canada. We can allow this WEF and these new world order powers to take over and to impose this new system of stakeholder capitalism, which really, again, is communism. Then we would see shortages. Then we would see an undersupply of goods that we so desperately need. This I find to be totally undesirable. I assume you do as well. So, for that reason, consider joining us at the Alberta Prosperity Project to tell as many Albertans as possible on the many, many benefits and merits of independence, like protecting and upholding the free market system.